RPGs are big, epic games that normally span dozens, even hundreds of gameplay hours and take large teams of dedicated developers years to make. Because of that, RPGs are rarely a newbie game developer's first finished project. But I actually think it's possible for your first game to be an RPG as long as you keep the scope in check. Instead of looking to big, modern RPGs for inspiration, first-time developers should use early games as the blueprint for their games. And the older an RPG is, the easier it will be to learn from and even imitate. In my opinion, the best game to draw upon is the original Dragon Quest. The first Dragon Quest was a landmark game in the history of console RPGs. Surprisingly, it still holds up well today, for the most part. Check out my buddy HPR Shredder's review if you don't believe me. Dragon Quest somehow crams all the major story beats a player would expect from an RPG, and feels like a satisfying adventure, even though it's barely a 5-hour playthrough with just a single party member, just a handful of dungeons to explore and monsters to defeat, and a minuscule amount of optional content. There are many factors that contribute to Dragon Quest feeling like such a complete experience. The world and dungeon design, the streamlined character progression, memorable music, and overall pacing all contribute to Dragon Quest feeling like a complete adventure. However, in my opinion, the biggest reason Dragon Quest feels like such a complete experience is due to the way it presents its story and its world to the player. Instead of long cutscenes, the events of Dragon Quest's story are given context from the moment-to-moment gameplay and play out in the player's own imagination. And that is the first lesson I think developers should take from the original Dragon Quest. While not as flashy as well-directed cinematics, Dragon Quest's gameplay-focused approach makes the adventure feel more personal. Here's a good example of what I mean. There's a moment in the original Dragon Quest where the player stumbles upon a belt. While some NPCs share rumors of cursed items out in the world, pretty much everything you found in Dragon Quest up until this point is helpful, so most players probably equip the belt on their first playthrough, only to discover that they're less accurate in combat, and worse, they're banished from Tantagel Castle. That's the main city in the game and the location of the game's only save point. That means you can't save until you remove the belt and break the curse. To do that, you have to travel back across the world map to a specific NPC hanging out in another town and pay him to remove the belt. In other games, this would be a dedicated side quest with cutscenes and dialogue. Maybe an impish monster would appear to mock you and explain the belt's debilitating effects. Then, a new side quest would be added to your journal, and a waypoint added to the minimap, showing where to find the right NPC to remove the curse. Such a presentation would be flashier and more cinematic, sure, and some may argue less annoying, but the chain of events and its conclusion would ultimately be the same. I actually don't think the modern cinematic approach would be any better than how Dragon Quest presents it already from a gameplay perspective. Requiring players to discover the belt, its effects, and the way to remove it through exploration and problem solving puts the onus on the player. It makes their quest to break the curse a self-imposed one, and adds a sense of ownership to eventually solving the puzzle, not to mention the mistake of putting on the clearly cursed belt in the first place. For me, this is exactly the kind of immersion and player-driven exploration that I adore, and it's what I hope to achieve with my own game. Of course, there are limitations to this style of storytelling. The most obvious is that it's harder to convey changes in a character's growth or personality, or complex emotional beats. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would be difficult to do for newbie game developers with limited time, skills, and budgets, especially when dialogue and cutscenes are much more effective at this. Directed cutscenes and dialogue also make it easier to curate the kind of emotional experience you want your player to have. For example, once the player knows what the cursed belt is, they'll avoid equipping it and just sell it to a vendor, making it virtually impossible to recapture that sense of surprise on subsequent playthroughs. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's true of any major story beat, but cinematics and directed sequences are better at evoking a specific emotion, even if the player's seen them before and knows what's going to happen. It's also possible the player could simply avoid that moment entirely. In fact, most of the big story moments in Dragon Quest, like the Cursed Belt side quest, or even finding and saving the princess, which is one of the main goals of the game, are entirely optional and rely on the player to either stumble upon them, take notes along the way, or have an iron trap memory. That could lead to player frustration. Some players prefer the cinematic presented style of storytelling over internalized gameplay-driven storytelling, and they may find the gameplay focus too ambiguous. Again, if everything is left to the imagination, it's hard to curate the experience. And the fact is that modern game design has conditioned us to see unexpected negative effects in games, like equipping a cursed belt that totally blocks your progress as inconveniences of outdated game design rather than valid emergent challenges. And to a certain extent, that's kinda true. I mean, there's a reason why quest logs and objective markers are so commonplace these days. That said, I argue the more immersive, internalized form of storytelling, which is often called environmental or atmospheric storytelling, if you like, is exactly how games should be telling their stories. Games are supposed to be interactive and put the player in control of the experience. I have absolutely nothing wrong with cutscenes or cinematic gameplay, but I think games undermine their ability to tell unique gameplay-driven experiences when they try to emulate movies. Anyway, that's not really the point. What I'm trying to convey here is that Dragon Quest offers an alternative storying approach that is stripped down compared to the dialogue and cutscene-driven method, and I think this is how solo hobbyist game designers should be designing their first RPGs or action-adventure games, at least when it comes to narrative presentation. In fact, plenty of contemporary games tell most or all of their story this way. The Soulsborne games are an excellent example. You should take that as permission to use this narrative approach as well. Now, some folks may worry that emulating an old RPG like Dragon Quest will make their game feel outdated or limited, and look, it might, but that's kind of the point. And it brings me to the second major lesson I think first-time RPG developers should take from Dragon Quest, and that is to limit your scope. From the perspective of modern players used to AAA RPGs, the original Dragon Quest is going to sound extremely restrictive. This is a game with a single party member with a limited skill set and just a few items to equip, a slim roster of mostly palette-swapped enemies to fight, and again, very little to do outside of that. But the thing is you'd be surprised at just how much work it can take to create, test, and balance even a small game like this for a solo developer. So while you might be thinking you're going to create the next Tales of Arise or Skyrim, the fact is you should really be trying to make Dragon Quest. The more restrained your scope, the easier it will be to complete your game. But don't take that to mean that your game won't be interesting to play or that it will lack meaningful role-playing opportunities, nor does it mean that you have to turn your game into a repetitive, predictable chore to play. The key is understanding the difference between variety and variance. See, most modern RPGs are chock full of variety. They have tons of loot, skills, combat rules, class systems, mini-games, huge bestiaries filled with unique enemies, litanies of side quests. You get the idea. Older RPGs didn't have as much variety. Dragon Quest I looks downright anemic by comparison. And that's just the reality of it. Older RPGs didn't have much variety because they were dealing with such limited hardware capabilities. But they were able to overcome these limitations and still deliver a fulfilling RPG experience using variance. Let's look at Dragon Quest I again. Combat is the sole focus of Dragon Quest I. You could argue it's really the only role-playing that you do in the game. However, unlike tabletop RPGs or more complex PC RPGs that were coming out at the same time as Dragon Quest, the original Dragon Quest uses a fairly simplistic combat formula to decide whether an attack or a spell hits, and how much damage is dealt. The main equation for deciding how much damage the player deals to an enemy is attack strength minus opponent defense divided by 2 divided by 2. Now, if combat in Dragon Quest was based solely on the raw damage, a hero with 50 attack strength would always deal 20 damage against an enemy with 20 defense. However, to avoid each combat action having the same predetermined hit chance, the developers add a variance value to each formula's output. In Dragon Quest, it is a plus or minus 10% variance value. So by adding that variance value, the actual damage for a hero with 50 attack against an enemy with 20 defense is between 18 and 22 damage rather than a base flat 20 damage. There's also a chance to score a critical hit, which increases the possible damage even higher. I know that's a lot of math, but the point is, variance prevents combat from feeling like a simple stat check. Dragon Quest I also applies variance to the hero's stats growth, slightly modifying the stat increases with each level up based on what the player names their character at the beginning of the game. Of course, some people will probably argue that it would be better to chock your game full of more content variety to stave off repetition rather than just variance to combat formulas, because if all you're doing is fighting monsters, at some point that will get repetitious. And yeah, that's true, but remember, the more variety of content, the more work you have to do. By comparison, just adding variance to a small handful of gameplay systems is much more manageable. Let's assume you're making an RPG that sticks with Dragon Quest I's blueprint of a single character that engages in 1 versus 1 combat against enemies and follows a traditional turn-based rule set as the core gameplay mechanic. There are many ways to introduce variance to this without programming tons of enemies, skills, or other systems. You could start by doubling down on the variance modifiers that Dragon Quest already has to more areas of combat. From there, you could introduce variance to enemy stats or ability pools, even between monsters of the same type. You could add variance between weapons and armor of the same type. You could add variance to encounter rates, loot locations, or even dungeon map layouts. But if you wanted to branch out from that, you could, of course, opt for action-based combat. In fact, many single-character RPGs opt for real-time action combat since that has more inherent variance than a one-on-one turn-based system. Of course, if you were sticking with a turn-based system, you could add other mechanical layers like stamina meters, ATB meters, weapon durability, class systems, different roles for your party members, etc. Dragon Quest II and III are really good examples of this. Both games use the same basic turn-based combat rules as the original Dragon Quest, and heavily emphasize combat as the core role-playing vector, but Dragon Quest II and III are more interesting simply by having multi-character parties, each one with their own unique stats, classes, skills, equipment possibilities, etc. You also face off against multi-enemy encounters rather than one-on-one, and many of these systems have a level of variance baked in. These aren't that much more complicated than the original Dragon Quest, but they offer a lot more strategic possibility. That said, you could easily add variance to a super simple RPG like Dragon Quest by introducing extra limitations that affect the player in combat that play upon different variance values. One way to do this is by adding more resource management, such as, again, weapon durability, cooldowns, and status debuffs that affect each action you have available at a given time. In that way, a game could have only 5 to 6 weapon types and spells to equip, and just a handful of monsters to fight, but the dynamic limitations allow unique combat scenarios and strategies to emerge through systemic interplay rather than bespoke design. Game design buzzwords aside, the point is you can add variance to pretty much any gameplay system if you really want to. Just note that variance is rarely random. It's usually based on a limited value range, and too much variance can feel like arbitrary randomness to the player. So be careful, unless that's what you're after. By properly implementing a level of variance to your game, you could make an RPG with tightly constrained content still feel interesting. An example I encourage everyone to check out is it's 6 random characters on a single dungeon floor. That's the whole game. That's seriously the title. The game's by Cannibal Interactive, and its limited scope is spelled out right there in the title, and yet you could play it for hours and experience totally new dungeon layouts, party compositions, item drops, and enemy encounters each run. As for me, the lessons I've taken from the original Dragon Quest narrative and gameplay systems have helped me in my own dungeon crawler RPG. Personally, I prefer designing interesting gameplay scenarios and drawing characters rather than writing plot or balancing tons of items. I also have limited time, resources, and experience with certain skills, specifically programming, so I've accepted that my game just won't be massive in scope. However, I still want to give players the sense they're going on an adventure and capture their imagination, and to keep them on their toes even if they know their way through the dungeon's many floors. And by taking some smart cues from Dragon Quest and games like it, I think I've come up with some ways to do that. And I'll be sharing more about those ideas and other gameplay systems in the near future, so be sure to subscribe so you can catch those updates and all my future videos. Anyway, my goal with this video is to give you an alternate way of looking at story and gameplay, and maybe even deepen your appreciation for how old games like Dragon Quest were able to do so much with so little. And hopefully even inspire you to make your own small-scale RPG, even if it's just your first game. Maybe you won't be able to craft a 50-hour epic filled with tons of unique gameplay systems and tons of content to explore, but you can absolutely create a fun, engrossing, and fulfilling RPG journey that someone out there will love using the same techniques and restraints Dragon Quest did over 35 years ago.